The soundstage of American dialogue hummed with anticipation, the air charged with the static electricity of pre-show tension. Bright lights beat down on the polished oak desk where Mason Reed, the show's celebrity host, drummed his manicured fingers impatiently. His normally composed features were tight with concentration as he flipped through his preparation notes one last time. 15 minutes to air, called the floor director, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. Mason nodded curtly, not bothering to look up. Is he here yet? The question came out sharper than intended. Vice President Vance arrived 5 minutes ago, the young assistant producer replied, her voice dropping slightly. He's in the green room. Mason's lips curled into a subtle smile as he closed his leather portfolio. Perfect. The word hung in the air, laden with unspoken intention. Behind the cameras, network executives huddled in a tight circle, their hushed voices barely audible over the bustle of the crew. This is a ratings goldmine, whispered Sandra Palmer, the network's programming director. Reed's been planning this ambush for weeks. Her colleague nodded, eyes fixed on the monitor displaying the green room feed, where J.D. Vance sat calmly reviewing his own notes, seemingly unaware of what awaited him. Mason's got him cornered with those leaked documents. There's no way Vance walks away from this unscathed. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees as Mason stood, straightening his tailored navy suit. The spotlights caught the glint of his diamond cufflinks as he reached for his earpiece. Remember, came the executive producer's voice through the comm system, hit him with the fabricated quotes first, then the edited clips. Don't give him room to breathe. Mason's smile didn't reach his eyes. Trust me, by the time I'm done with him, the vice president will wish he never accepted our invitation. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness as the crew made final adjustments. The audience, carefully selected for their political leanings, settled into their seats, the low murmur of anticipation filling the studio. And if you're enjoying this insider look at media manipulation, make sure to hit the subscribe button below. You won't want to miss our upcoming exposés on how the mainstream media crafts narratives rather than reports truth. Hit that bell notification too so you never miss out when we post new content. The floor director's hands shot up, fingers splayed. 5, 4, 3. She silently mouthed the final numbers as the theme music swelled. The on-air light flashed red, and Mason Reed's face transformed, the calculated hardness melting into the warm, inviting smile that had made him a household name. Good evening, America. I'm Mason Reed, and this is American Dialogue, where today's most pressing conversations happen. His voice resonated with practiced sincerity. Tonight, we have a special guest joining us, Vice President J.D. Vance. The audience applauded on cue as Vance walked onto the set, his stride measured and unhurried. The handshake between the two men lasted barely a second longer than necessary, a subtle power play noticed only by the most observant viewers. Thank you for having me, Mason, Vance said, settling into the guest chair. Its position angled slightly lower than the host's, another subtle psychological tactic employed by the show. The pleasure is all mine, Mason replied, the words dripping with honey-coated insincerity that prickled against the skin like invisible needles. It's not every day we get a sitting vice president on our show. The small talk lasted precisely 3 minutes, just long enough to lull the audience into a false sense of security before Mason leaned forward, his posture shifting imperceptibly from welcoming to predatory. Mr. Vice President, before we discuss your new economic initiative, I'd like to clear up some statements attributed to you. He nodded to the production booth, and the large screen behind them flickered to life. These quotes recently surfaced from what appears to be a private fundraising event. Vance's expression remained neutral as the screen displayed a series of damning quotes, allegedly from him, disparaging rural voters, the very demographic that had formed his most loyal base. I don't recall saying any of that, Vance replied calmly, because I didn't. Mason's smile widened fractionally. Well, we have multiple sources confirming these statements, Mr. Vice President. Are you calling all of them liars? The studio lights seemed to intensify, beading sweat on the host's forehead that he quickly dabbed away during a camera transition. The temperature in the room had risen several degrees, the heat pressing down like an invisible weight. I'm simply stating a fact, Mason, Vance countered, his voice steady. Those quotes are fabricated. But I'm curious, would you mind sharing these multiple sources with me? A flicker of annoyance crossed Mason's face before he regained his composure. We protect our sources, as I'm sure you understand. But I can assure you, they're impeccable. Impeccable unnamed sources? Vance nodded thoughtfully. Interesting standard of journalism. Mason cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the suddenly tense atmosphere. The scent of his expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the hint of nervous perspiration now emanating from him. Perhaps we should move on to the video evidence. The screen behind them changed to show Vance speaking at a rally, his words seemingly condemning immigrants and dismissing climate change concerns. The editing was skillful, almost undetectable to the casual viewer. That's quite an impressive edit job, Vance remarked, still unnervingly calm. But it's still an edit job. Mason's expression hardened. Are you suggesting we manipulated this footage, Mr. Vice President? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating it directly. Vance reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a small thumb drive. May I? Without waiting for permission, he stood and walked to the production desk, handing the drive to a confused technician. The studio had gone completely silent, the audience holding their collective breath. What exactly are you doing? Mason demanded, his carefully constructed poise beginning to crack. Providing context, Vance replied simply. Please play the contents of that drive on the main screen. The producer looked to Mason, who hesitated before giving a terse nod. What harm could it do? The screen flickered again, and the same rally appeared, but this time, the full, unedited version played. Vance's comments, in proper context, conveyed a message dramatically different from the edited clips. The audience stirred, murmurs of surprise rippling through the studio. Mason's face had grown pale, but he rallied quickly. One edited clip doesn't invalidate the pattern of concerning statements we've compiled, he insisted, shuffling his notes. Let's discuss your controversial stance on... Before we move on, Vance interrupted gently, I think we should address the other videos you were planning to show. Mason froze, his pen hovering above his notepad. I'm not sure what you mean. The 3 other doctored clips in your rundown, Vance elaborated. The ones your production team edited yesterday between 2 and 7 p.m. A hush fell over the studio. Even the cameramen exchanged glances. That's absurd, Mason scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. You couldn't possibly know what's in my rundown. Vance's smile remained placid. Just like I couldn't possibly know that before this interview, you told your executive producer, and I quote, trust me, by the time I'm done with him, the vice president will wish he never accepted our invitation. The blood drained from Mason's face so quickly, it was visible even under the studio makeup. The pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk with a sound that seemed to echo in the stunned silence. How did you... Mason caught himself, but too late. How did I know that? Vance finished for him. The same way I know about the meeting you had last Thursday with representatives from the Progressive Action Committee, where you discussed, and again I quote, taking Vance down a peg before the midterms. In the control room, panic had erupted. The director was frantically signaling for a commercial break, but the producer stood frozen, headset dangling from her fingers as she watched the scene unfold. Mason's composure had completely shattered now, his eyes darting between Vance and the increasingly restless audience. Those are private conversations that you've clearly obtained illegally. Nothing illegal about it, Vance replied, his voice still measured, creating a stark contrast to Mason's growing agitation. Your network's security isn't as robust as you might think, but more importantly, I find it fascinating that you're suddenly concerned with privacy and proper sourcing. The vice president leaned forward slightly, his presence somehow expanding to fill the studio, despite his relaxed posture. You see, Mason, the problem with setting a trap is that you need to make sure you're not standing in it yourself. The host's breathing had become audible now, the microphone picking up each shallow intake of air. The familiar scent of the studio, a mixture of makeup, hot lights, and electronic equipment, was now tinged with the unmistakable metallic tang of fear. What exactly are you implying? Mason managed. His trademark confidence evaporated. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Vance gestured to the screen behind them, which now displayed emails between Mason and his producers discussing how to edit Vance's statements to make them appear more controversial. Facts with sources I can actually cite. The audience had begun to stir more actively now, smartphones raised to capture the moment no one had anticipated. The hashtag #ReadTrapped was already trending on social media platforms, clips of the exchange being shared in real time. This is an invasion of our network's private communications, Mason sputtered, reaching for his water glass with a visibly trembling hand. Interesting, Vance noted. When you obtain private information through your impeccable sources, it's journalism. When that same standard is applied to you, it's an invasion. The control room had descended into chaos. The network executives who had been so smugly anticipating Vance's public humiliation were now frantically calling their legal department. Mason's earpiece crackled with urgent instructions, but he seemed beyond the capacity to follow them. Sweat now freely ran down his temples, the studio lights feeling as hot as the fires of judgment now bearing down on him. We need to take a commercial break, he finally announced, his voice cracking. Actually, Vance interjected smoothly, according to your contract with my office for this appearance, there are to be no breaks during the first 30 minutes. We still have 12 minutes remaining. The audience's murmurs had grown louder, the tide of public opinion visibly shifting as they witnessed the unraveling of the carefully orchestrated ambush. Let's talk about journalism ethics, Mason, Vance continued, seemingly the only person in the room completely at ease. About the responsibility media figures have to present information fairly, especially when it impacts public discourse. Mason's complexion had taken on a grayish tinge. I stand by our reporting methods. Even when they involve deliberate manipulation, Vance pressed, perhaps we should discuss the text messages between you and your producer about creating alternative facts if my responses weren't provocative enough. The host's eyes widened in undisguised horror. Those messages were on my personal device. Yes, they were, Vance agreed. The same personal device where you store other messages, like the ones coordinating hit pieces with other networks. The same device that contains evidence of how you've treated other guests who don't share your political views. The tension in the studio had become almost unbearable, a palpable force pressing down on everyone present. The scent of Mason's defeat, a mixture of cooling sweat and fading cologne, seemed to permeate the air. This isn't about me, Mason attempted weakly. The American people deserve to know. The truth? Vance finished for him. I couldn't agree more. That's precisely why I came prepared today. The screen behind them changed again, this time displaying a compilation of Mason's off-air comments about his own audience. Disparaging remarks about their intelligence, their beliefs, and their value beyond ratings numbers. A gasp rippled through the studio audience, followed by expressions of outrage. Several people stood up, pointing accusatory fingers at the now crumbling host. Those comments are taken out of context, Mason protested, the irony of his statement lost on no one. Are they? Vance asked mildly. Perhaps we should play the full clips, just as we did with mine. For context, of course. Mason's shoulders slumped in defeat. The trap he had so carefully laid had not only failed to capture its intended prey, but had snapped shut on its creator instead. Ladies and gentlemen, Vance addressed the audience directly for the first time. What you're witnessing today isn't just about one interview gone wrong. It's about a fundamental question. Who do you trust to give you information? Those who manipulate facts to fit narratives, or those who let the truth speak for itself? The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. The cameras, which should have been focused on Mason, had all swiveled to capture Vance's unexpected moment of triumph. In the control room, the network executives watched in horror as their ratings simultaneously soared. This was compelling television, after all, while their credibility crumbled in real time. The sad reality, Vance continued once the applause had died down, is that what happened here today isn't an isolated incident. It's symptomatic of a media ecosystem more interested in crafting narratives than reporting facts. Mason, now sensing his career imploding before his eyes, made one desperate attempt to regain control. "You orchestrated this entire thing," he accused, his voice breaking. "You baited us." Vance shook his head slowly. "No, Mason, I simply came prepared for the trap you set. The difference is, I brought the truth with me." The remaining minutes of the guaranteed interview time stretched interminably for Mason, each second another nail in the coffin of his journalistic reputation. When the director finally called for a commercial break after the mandated 30 minutes, Mason practically fled the set, ignoring the calls from his producer. The aftermath was swift and merciless. By morning, clips of the interview had been viewed millions of times across all social media platforms. Reed Trapped and Vance Truth Bomb dominated trending topics. Three major advertisers had already pulled their sponsorship from American Dialogue, citing concerns about journalistic integrity. Mason Reed issued a formal apology 2 days later, claiming that overzealous producers had acted without his knowledge, a defense that collapsed when Vance's team released additional communications directly contradicting this claim. The network announced Mason's voluntary leave of absence the following week. But perhaps the most significant impact came 6 months later when a comprehensive media reform bill passed through Congress with unprecedented bipartisan support. The legislation, championed by Vice President Vance, established new standards for journalistic accountability and transparency in sourcing. During the signing ceremony, a reporter asked Vance if the now infamous interview had been the catalyst for the legislation. "Sometimes," he replied with a small smile. "The best way to expose a broken system is to let it trap itself. Because in the end, the truth doesn't need editing, manipulation, or carefully crafted narratives. It simply needs to be given a voice. And when it speaks, even the most elaborate traps fall apart under its weight. So if you believe in the power of truth and honest reporting, make sure to like this video, share it with others who value integrity in media, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that cut through the noise to bring you the facts. God bless you all, and God bless America."